Hi, I'm Bob Spinozzi, and welcome to Small Town. On today's show, we're going to turn the clock back to December 11th of last year and reflect upon the great ice storm of 2008. It was colossal, and its aftermath left nearly 1 million homes and businesses in much of New England without power. In so many areas, tree limbs and power lines collapsed under the crushing weight of ice. Hundreds of roads were closed, as were schools and businesses. And here in Littleton, well, we got hammered. Now let's take a look at the weather map as it looked back then on December 11th. Started out as heavy precipitation, high winds, Cape and the Islands, up through the South Shore, and then into Boston, where they accumulated up to 4 inches of rain. Rain really continued up to about 128, and from 128 north into the Merrimack Valley, Essex County, and into southern New Hampshire, it turned to ice. And heavy winds as well, continued across the state, enveloped the entire state. Now I want to read this quote from Governor Patrick that was in the Boston Globe on Friday, December 12th. There are 350,000 households without power right now in Massachusetts, and the areas hardest hit by the storm are Route 2 and the Interstate 495 corridor, and also northern Worcester County. Now he went on to say that the earliest estimate that we have for power being restored is Monday, and I think many of us view that as an ambitious estimate to this point. Now let me quickly summarize what happened. We got hit with that low pressure system that I mentioned, but it had an unusual combination of 3 layers of air. A warm layer in the middle, flanked by a layer of cold air on either side. The recipe for an ice storm. Now normally when this occurs, sleet hits the ground. But in this case, Mother Nature gave us a phenomenon called supercooled drops. And that is what encrusted the trees and power lines with an inch-thick sheet of ice. Now right now it's my pleasure to have with me Littleton Light General Manager Savos Danos, who will better describe these supercooled drops, but more importantly, to go over the storm's impact on Littleton. And then later, you'll hear accounts taped last year from Selectman Joe Knox and Janet Wilkinson, Highway Operations Manager Jimmy Clyde, and Highway Foreman Danny Tibbetts, and also Littleton residents John Hathaway, Andrea Curran, and Andy Bowers.
On December 11, 2008, we went to bed hearing the falling of rain, which soon turned to sleet, and the next thing we knew came the crackling of tree limbs all over the roof. And then in the night came a shattering sound. 'Twas the snapping of branches and trees falling down, with a noise just like guns going off in the woods, which meant hardly anyone slept very good. Or slept very well, because good is just wrong. But never mind, let's just get on with the song. Sing tooralai, ooralai, ooralai. Sing tooralai, ooralai.
So if you want to go back to that famous December 11th day, it was a very nice morning, and I watched the weather probably like you did the night before. I knew a storm was coming, but didn't have any idea that what was going to happen. And I had a phone call from fellow Selectman McCurdy, and he told me that we should probably call everyone up and have an emergency meeting because the conditions were that bad. Of course, I didn't realize it at the time, because when I looked up my backyard, there was no trees down, the icicles were coming down, it was beautiful. So I thought Alex was telling the story till I looked out front and saw trees down, whatever. He said we had to have an emergency meeting. Well, it would be the best thing for us to do. So that's when I called you, but before I called you, I'd actually called Ken. Ken was out of town, and Jimmy was working for the Mass Department of Corrections. I couldn't get him, so it was Alex, yourself, and myself. And if you remember that famous morning when I called you, it was like taking you out of a deathbed.
Right, I was sick as a dog with the flu. Yeah. And you called, and I just grabbed the phone and didn't recognize the name and dropped it on the floor. And then you called again, and I picked it up that time, and I think I answered it and then dropped it on the floor because the caller ID said Noz, K-N-O-Z. And I said, I don't know anybody named Noz, and was not coherent anyway, having the cold or flu. Oh, so I just kept dropping the phone.
I actually feel better now. I thought you would just ignore me completely.
No.
So then I woke you up, and it was important. We realized how bad it was, and going down to pick you up, when I saw Bruce Street at that time, I realized just how bad it was, and even heading down to your house. But after I picked you up, I'd like you to tell the story that...
No, you tell it. You have to tell it.
When we rounded the corner coming up at a Lorry Lane, we looked to the left and started going that direction, and up further by the corner, the power lines were hanging, and there was an enormous tree hanging right on top of it, and
the pole, the pole was down.
The pole,
with the tree,
the pole was hanging; it wasn't completely down.
Down, that's true. There was plenty of space.
Yeah, and that's when you said we can make it.
Underneath.
Underneath, yeah.
Sure.
So here we have two of the selectmen. They have to go down for an emergency meeting. We're going to take a chance of going under a tree. So that's when I figured you must have been really ill at that point.
Well, I was, because my poor sense of science told me that if you're in a car and struck by lightning, the cage of the car protects you, which is true. But of course, that's different from a cable from a phone or an electric line falling on you. It doesn't have the same effect, I understand, afterwards. So that would have probably been tragic if it had fallen on us.
But the funny thing is, I think a lot of people were just like ourselves. Even later in the day, going down that street again, I saw cars going underneath that and how dangerous it was because they didn't want to go all the way around. But on the way down, we met Alex at the high school, and we did call an emergency meeting.
Right.
We declared a state of emergency because we needed it. And at that time, it was obvious how bad things actually were, because to get down that street, we had to move some of the trees to get by. And as the day went on, I think it taught the people in the town, the people in town government, a lot of things that we can learn in the future or put to better use, because everyone works so fine together, and it's actually part of the town report that will be in the town report that I wrote up for this year, because things went really well. But at the same time, we learned something from that, because I called you, you called me, we had people calling us, and we couldn't get in contact with some of the town leaders and some of the departments until late in the afternoon.
That's right. And we also learned that you should know where the blankets are. Because we went down to town hall, and of course we're saying, oh, we'll just go get blankets in the cabinets, in the closets, and of course there was no power. And when you're fishing around in closets, big closet space, with no power, we couldn't find anything. Then we had to find flashlights and keys, and could not find any blankets.
I forgot all about that, because we did look like two fools down there.
Right.
We couldn't see where we were going, putting our hands out, trying to find blankets
right. Couldn't see a
Alex
thing.
told us where they were. I don't think they were in the right spot.
No, I think they were somewhere else.
We didn't find them that day.
And Steve Venuti showed up with keys. He was still there. He made it through the storm and gave us the keys, which didn't help because there were no blankets behind those locked doors. And he found a flashlight, I guess. So, yeah, it's very dark in a room with no windows when it's, no lights. So you either need electricity or something to find those blankets.
Now, on the serious side, too, when you look back at how well Littleton handled the emergency, you take a look at what other towns went through and what we actually went through. And I did make a trip to the fire station and met with the two chiefs in Savos from the light department. And we knew how serious it was. When I was at the fire department, crews were coming in and out. They actually had a board up there with house numbers, and they were putting down how many inches of water they actually had in the basement, and they were trying to take care of everyone down the list. And they were nonstop when I was there. And Savos had crews from, I know he had Wakefield and 2 or 3 other towns, like maybe Reading and another one, that were working on the project for the next 3 or 4 days, and we ended up a lot better than
anybody.
Yeah,
I think well, the electric department did a fabulous job. I know my power was only out for 4 or 5 hours. We were very lucky. I know other people in town were out longer, but nothing compared to towns like Fitchburg and Lunenburg and communities out there. We did much better. Even Westford and Chelmsford suffered more than we did.
Sure
so
did.
We were great, and our schools were open mostly, and the kids got off eventually, and I thought it was great. And I thought the MRC did a great job getting to the high school and having everything set up. They had food and places for people to stay warm until they switched over to the Harvard schools, I guess. But it was a great opportunity for them to practice in a situation that wasn't as critical as it could be in the future for something else.
Yeah, they're going to be a great asset in the future. They proved themselves in that first time.
Yeah.
And you hate to say it, but like you said, it was good training for them to get them up and running and see what actually could happen. And all in all, I think Littleton did a fine job, and we're pretty proud of everyone that worked for us.
Right, I agree.
We awoke to a cold house and looked out the door at a scene of destruction resembling war, but a beauty that nearly took our breath away, and we knew this would not be a typical day.
Now, Savos, you were the point man that night. What happened? Or more appropriately, what didn't happen?
Well, I've been with the department since 1982, and this was by far, I call this a perfect storm, it was by far the largest outage in the history of the light department modern day. Back in 1998, I think you and I were saying earlier, we had a 3-day outage. This outage lasted 5+ days, which is almost doubling our worst outage before.
Now, I had mentioned earlier the issue of the formation, rather, of supercooled drops. Could you maybe get into that a little bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah, and it was interesting the information you told me earlier about the supercooled drops. What happened in Littleton, and it transcended from basically 495 all the way out to New Ipswich, New Hampshire, and out to through Worcester County. What happened is, again, as you said, the supercooled drops were falling and they formed ice, and we got over 1 inch of ice. But what was interesting about Littleton, the Littleton area where the ice was, that the ground level was warm enough where there wasn't that much ice at the ground level. Most of the icing occurred at about 20 feet and above. And what that seemed to do in our system was it overloaded pine trees where they would snap in half, and oak trees were being torn up by the roots. And what we found in other utilities where the icing didn't get all the way to the ground, or not as much to the ground as what's typical, there was so much of a burden at the top of structures, maybe utility poles or the trees, that they were snapping or being pulled out from the roots because the roots were not iced over. The ground was fairly soft. So there wasn't, if you will, foundation to support trees and utility poles, and hence significant devastation.
Well, now, as I recall, too, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was a real flip-flop in temperatures in this whole very small amount of time. The storm hit that night. The next day, it was actually very warm.
Yes.
And very windy, though, too.
Yes.
But then that night, it
froze up again.
Immediately froze up.
Even
went
worse.
Down into the teens, I believe.
Yeah, and you had secondary damage because of that. With the wind and the refreezing created additional havoc on top of everything that happened the first night from about. And here in Littleton and Boxborough, our service territory, it happened fairly late, whereby our icing was much later than other communities. The first calls came in around 11 o'clock, so the icing really only began around 9 o'clock, and it was very quick because it was raining so hard and it was freezing so fast. Generally, an ice storm, you get a sleet, transition to ice, and then transition to snow or rain, or depending which way it's going. Here was a very hard rain that was freezing on everything. Because the cold inversion had taken place in the cold air, but the cold air had come down to about 20 feet only, and so there's a layer from 20 feet to 70 feet of just significant icing because of the inch of rainfall.
And then this very interesting statistic that we were looking at a short time ago. 1/4 inch of ice can add about 500 pounds of weight per line span. So going down the line on a long run of poles and wires, that's tons of weight, of extra weight on the system.
And we were lucky there to some degree, and then compared to our neighbors who were out for, if you will, 10 to 12 days versus our 5 days, and that includes towns just to the west of us, Groton and Harvard. And one of the things is, I'm the point man, but I have a great engineering staff of Scott Edwards and Nick Lawler and John Stewart running our operations and the guys. And what we've done, as we've converted the town over, there's been a lot of change in the town, a lot of growth in the town, and we put in new utility poles. We used to use Class 3 poles. We're using Class 2 and Class 1 poles, and so we maybe were able, on the main lines, to weather some of that weight.
So the system could take care of the extra weight.
A little better
somehow.
than some others because we use more stout poles. Clearly, the laterals, the secondary lines, the side streets, which have the older, thinner poles, were breaking because of the weight. Forget about tree weight, just the weight of the ice on the wires, way above the carrying capacity of those poles. And you saw that significantly in other towns west of here. But our main lines did not do badly under pole stress unless a tree hit them because they were a more stout pole. And so it may change the thought process for not only Littleton going forward, but clearly for the utilities that a typical Class 3 pole might not be the answer to help prevent or mitigate from these kinds of catastrophic activities.
Okay, now let's get back to the repair cleanup.
Okay.
Governor Patrick called in 500 National Guardsmen. You have, I believe, 4 crews in town. You had 4 crews working, but you did get a little assistance from a couple of other towns?
Yes. Littleton Electric Light is part of the NEPA response crew. And through a process, we were able to get support. We had 2 crews from Marblehead work for us, 2 crews from Wakefield, a crew from Georgetown, 2 crews from Middleton that worked for us for different durations of the storm. So we had our 4 crews, and we even brought Jack Schimmel out of retirement. He was we call emeritus lineman, and he even ran a crew with one of our young apprentice linemen and had a great time, I think, doing it because he knows the system so well. But along with our 4 crews and our support staff of engineers and supervisors, we had 5 additional crews, 6 in one day, but 5 additional crews working for Littleton to help restoration in Littleton and Boxborough.
Okay. Now, reimbursement, I'm going to just bring that up. The New England states got about $80 million from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Massachusetts got about $49 million, and we received a small portion. Could you tell us how that process works?
Sure. Interestingly, we were involved in disaster relief with FEMA to the Virgin Islands some years ago, so we're fairly comfortable in understanding of the FEMA reimbursement process because there's a lot of paperwork, and we're able to do all the paperwork ourselves. Some of the utilities, because of the size of the devastation, needed some consulting help because it's so massive. But we're able, I believe our submittal to FEMA for reimbursement was in the $250,000 to $260,000 range, and we have received a check for $200,000. From FEMA that went right back into our coffers to replenish our what's called depreciation account, which is what we use to pay all these bills for the restoration effort.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that we were out for 5 days. Some people were out. I believe I read that a week later, as many as 100,000 customers were still without power. People were were driving miles and miles just to buy emergency generators. Businesses were impacted. They got the double whammy. They were hurt by the storm, and it hit during the holiday season.
Right.
So it really curtailed the shopping.
Right. It's interesting. I recall going to bed, and just a little sidebar. I went to bed Saturday night, come home around 1 o'clock in the morning, and I said to my wife, and we live in Groton, my hometown. I think we got our power back on that Saturday afternoon, and I went to bed. And I said to Patty, Mass Ave in Boxborough, which is downtown Boxborough, if you will, for those who know Mass Ave, still didn't have any power. So we went into Sunday morning without any power to the police, fire, and town hall in Boxborough and the supporting businesses because of the complete devastation of the ridge line that takes our utilities into Boxborough. But getting back to the details of your question, we were off for about 5 days. We had... By Sunday afternoon, by the 3rd day, we had the backbone of the system fully operational. And an electric light distribution system works like a person's skeleton. You worry about the backbone and the limbs first to get the major people back on, and then you take care of the arms and the fingers. And so we had the backbone and the arms up and the legs up by the end of the day Sunday, and then it allowed us Monday and Tuesday to take care of the fingers and the wrists and the forearms, which were the side streets and the individual services that, unfortunately, some neighborhoods had many people with power and then 1 or 2 homes without power, and there's a certain frustration of these people. I've gone 5 days, my neighbors have power and your trucks go by me every day. How come, why am I not being restored? Why your trucks go by me every day? And that's very frustrating for a person to understand that our trucks aren't going to anyone, no one's more important than anyone else, but they're going to it's a triage. They're going to the location where they can do the most good, the quickest. So they'll go and they'll take care of the forearm and the arm before they get the fingers. And if you're a finger in an area that the forearm's in good shape, you're unfortunately the last person to be brought up because we have to take care of the forearms first to give most people back in power. That's what I use as the synonym for the way that we do restoration.
Okay, but the residents can actually do a better job too. Maybe this teaches us that we really should check on our neighbor to make sure that they're okay.
What I learned this time, again, a lot of new people in town, in electronics and electricity, obviously our foundation of our existence. And one thing I asked a lot of people, mostly those people where they were fingers, where the neighborhood might have had power, but yet they didn't. Why don't you, do you know your neighbor? No, I really don't. Maybe you should meet your neighbor. Maybe it's a good opportunity as Yankees, traditionalists, to meet your neighbors and start becoming friendly with the neighborhood because somebody in the neighborhood might have a generator. Not that I'm condoning people purchasing generators. Or if you're cold, a wood stove. Or if you're in a neighborhood that the backbone had power and only some of the fingers didn't, some of the individual homes did not have power, maybe you can run an extension cord to your neighbor's house or go over there and warm up and watch TV and learn what's going on, that kind of thing. So it did happen. I think the lesson learned in this is that we as society, and clearly in this area, New England area, learn to see what your neighbor, become friendly with your neighbors. As you said, you and I were speaking earlier, everyone's working 2 jobs, no one's ever home during the day, and unless you may be involved socially in maybe soccer or maybe band, you really don't know people in the community. It's time to learn your neighbors, because combined, I think a lot of things can be accomplished when people join the resources.
And there's another important thing that we can do, and that's to join community notification.
Definitely. This is very important. The lesson we learned, we had what was called the reverse 911 system, where we had the opportunity, or the ability from internally to get messages out to people. What happened was, because of all the phone calls coming in, the first 2 days of phone calls coming in with people without power, the next 3 days were people wondering if their power had been turned back on because they were no longer at home. So we found that our community notification process back then, because it was derived from internally, we couldn't use it because the lines are all clogged coming in. We now have something called community notification, which is a internet-based notification system that calls people in from outside of our service territory. In fact, there are 5 locations around the country, and one of the call centers will be activated depending on who has the most ability. And so what we're asking people to do, if you have an unlisted number, or if you have a listed number, make sure you're on the community notification process. Go to our website, www.lelwd.com, and register up to 5 phones. It can be your home phone, it can be 3 or 4 cell phones, it can even be a business phone, so that as public notification procedures come forward from either the Light and Water Department or from the Fire and Police Department, all those phones will be notified what's going on. May it be an outage, may it be a restoration of power, may it be a water outage, or may it be a community notification for some natural disaster or some issues facing the police and or fire department. So please, people, it's all confidential information. Look at the phone numbers you'd like to be contacted to be notified of a natural disaster or other activity within the community.
Let's hope that we don't have to go through this again.
Indeed, it's been 1-year anniversary, and we had a small snowstorm that night.
Right, earlier this month.
Yes.
One final thing I'd like to say, and that's congratulations again. Littleton Light has the lowest electric rates in the state.
Oh yes, thank you for that, Bob. Yeah, we're very proud of that. Our assistant manager Scott Edwards and some consultants have been working hard on our power supply portfolio. We have a real good staff of employees. And we've worked very diligently, and again, we can say that 1,000 kilowatt hours, which is what we consider to be the typical usage for a more robust home, that Littleton currently has the lowest electric rates in Massachusetts and, frankly, possibly New England.
And not just now. This goes way back now. You have more awards than Belichick has Super Bowls.
Oh, yeah.
No, seriously, you've had the lowest rates in the state, at least going back somewhere in the 1980s.
Yeah, we've had the lowest rates before, and then we've always been in the bottom third, or the best third, and among sometimes the bottom 10. We're back to the lowest rates in the state, and we hope to maintain that position for a while. It's something to be very proud of, and it's a function of all the good people I have around me, and a good board of water and light commissioners who interact with us in a very positive manner to help support our utilities.
Okay, that's great. Now, you know, we're going to continue, Savos, and go into the eye of the storm. In an interview taped last year, Highway Superintendent Jim Clyde and Highway Foreman Dan Tibbetts gave us their take on that memorable first night and beyond. So let's listen in.
Thank you.
The first call I got was actually from Dan. I was at the Rotary Christmas party at the Prouty New England Forestry House. The police called and said the roads were starting to get icy, so they called Dan to go check the roads, and that's where he started. That was around 7:30 or 8 o'clock, I guess.
Yep. I went out to check to see if the roads were icy, because that's what they called me for. Went out, there was no ice, but I was noticing that the trees were starting to build up with ice. So I was talking to the officer that called me and said, the roads aren't bad, but we will be having problems shortly because the trees are getting icy. And he's like, okay. Within 15 minutes, the first tree branch came down. So I went over, got that off the road, and then shortly after that, all the sections of town started to go. And I called in more help around 10:30, and then at 11 o'clock I called in another crew to start working, and I called Jim back around 11:30, 12 to let him know that it was getting pretty bad out here.
You could hear the tree limbs snapping, you know, in our neighborhood. We live down the Lake Mattawanakee area, so you're hearing that and you're not really sleeping so good anyway. And so I had already gotten up and said, well, it's time to go to work anyway. And then Dan called, and you know, I was getting dressed at that point anyway to come back to work. On the way in, you know, there was mostly pine branches at that point breaking, and it took me, normally it takes me about, you know, say 10 to 15 minutes to get to work. It's only 2 or 3 miles, and it probably took me 45 minutes or an hour to get there, because every 10 or 20 feet you're throwing another branch off, and you pull up again, pull another branch off. And we worked until I think we finally went home around 6:30 or 7 o'clock on Friday evening, and then we were back at I'm trying to think, I think we came back at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock on Saturday morning again.
Yeah.
Pretty much you know, the guys know if they need to take a break, they take a break. They pretty much worked right through. If somebody had power, you were able to get something to eat, hopefully. I think the light department had some stuff. We could go there if we needed, you know, meals. You know, some guys brought stuff in anyway, because we were fortunate because there's a generator at our facility. We had power that you could use the microwave and things like that. Most of the residents were very helpful. For the most part, pretty tolerant of what happened. They could see, you know, the damage because they were out of power, and you could see a lot of frustration because this was probably the longest time people were out of power. So they're, you know, getting frustrated.
I noticed a lot of people were coming out, making sure their neighbors were set. You know, they asked if as you were going by, hey, can you check on so and so? If they need something, just let me know, because they couldn't get to that point. You know, we're fortunate we have a shower at the garage, so I'd go home, get clothes, drive back to the garage, take a shower, drive home, you know, get bundled up, go to bed, get up and go to work the next day. And you could see after 2 days that you say, yeah, this is getting old now. Yep. Yeah, I just thank my guys for a great job. Thank the police station, fire station, the light department. You know, I think we all worked together and we got the job done. I think it was very good.
Because the town was hit pretty hard, you really can't, it's hard to get information out there to people, so that's a difficult situation for us. You know, you can do a reverse 911 or you can put it on the cable channel, but people are out of power, so they can't really get that information, so it was pretty difficult. You know, again, we're fortunate with a municipal light department that they do a great job. The fire department was great. The police department was great. I mean, if you're going to have a severe incident, this is the place to have it.
We were all affected by the storm, some worse than others. Next up, Andrea Curran, John Hathaway, and Andy Bauer are going to read letters that were submitted by residents outlining their own personal experience.
When we got up in the morning, I wasn't quite too concerned because the Littleton Electric Light Department never keeps their electricity off more than a few hours. But later in the afternoon, we got concerned, found out that my son had gone to Waltham and rented a room in a hotel for $150 some odd. That wasn't for me. We decided it was time for a vacation because I knew that I could go to Cape Cod, and in West Yarmouth I could get a room in the hotel there for $41 a night. And being a cheapskate, I chose that route. So we went to the Cape. We spent 3 nights there, came home, electricity was on, the house was warm again, no problem.
This story was sent in by Deborah Lance. Crack, pop, shudder, slam, crash. Those were the sounds my husband heard throughout the night as he tried to sleep, wondering if one of the many trees on our property would come crashing through the roof. Somehow, I thankfully slept peacefully through the entire night of horror. Thank goodness for Advil PM. When we woke up that morning to a no school announcement from Dr. Bemis, soon followed by information about the location of a shelter for those who needed it, we were puzzled. We had power, heat, water, phone service. Was the town overreacting? We peered out our windows and checked out the damage to our property. One tree that we had worried about this past summer had done just what the arborist had said it would do under extreme ice load. The entire top section of a massive oak in our backyard had snapped off and missed the house by about 2 yards. One end of the massive section of tree rested on the railing of our deck, but left the deck unscathed and only caused minor damage to our beloved hydrangea tree. Large branches littered our property and small trees were knocked down in our woods. The crown of one tree next to the house snapped, its branches dangling ominously over the ground, still clinging to the trunk. Our ice-coated steep driveway was impassable, as flexible white oaks bent to the ground in a U-shape under the ice load. Inconvenient, but quite pretty. Once we turned on the news, we realized that something big had indeed happened. Massive power outages, dangerous downed lines, damage to homes and cars. We did lose our power at 11 o'clock a.m. and it stayed out for about 3 hours. Inconvenient, but we called ourselves lucky and cheered Littleton Light and Water. During our brief power outage, the temperature rose and the ice began to thaw and drop off the trees whose branches hung over our house because of the weight of the ice. The sound of dropped ice skittering across our roof was frightening, and we scurried down to the bottom floor of the house just in case, holding our breath. As days passed, we started to hear from friends in town who had endured far worse than we. Families displaced, homes reaching 40 degrees in temperature, roofs damaged, trees coming through children's bedrooms during the night, a devastating fire. We count ourselves fortunate that we emerged relatively unscathed. As soon as the ice thawed, we brought a tree removal person in post-haste to take down those trees we had worried about over the summer, but had put off because of the economy. No sense in tempting fate twice.
The first recollection that I have is actually one of my own, and it involves the day after the ice storm and going up to Littleton Common. I was heartened to see that there was electricity in the common and that I could actually run some errands. I went into Colonial Gardens looking for some Christmas supplies. And yes, they had power, but no, they did not have the Christmas supplies I was looking for, and perhaps I could come back the next day. We were very fortunate along Great Road to have electricity. I met people there who had come as far as Lunenburg and Fitchburg, 20 miles or more, until they got to Littleton, where it was the first place they found power on, the first place they could get gasoline, the first place they could buy groceries. Anyway, I went back to Colonial Gardens the very next day, and they had exactly what I needed, but they no longer had electricity. And so I asked them, how is it that you had electricity and now you're without? And it turned out that, as happened in many cases, a transformer had blown and they were without electricity. As they were explaining this to me, I couldn't help but notice that the cash register was electrified. It had the digital display up and they were able to use it just fine. So I asked them, are you using batteries or what? And they said, no, we're just running an extension cord over from Subway. So I thought that was marvelous. Another example of neighbors helping neighbors.
This was sent in by Bev and Ken Schultz. My husband and I were without power for 3.5 days during the great ice storm of '08. We had no electricity, which meant no water, and no use of the stove. We have a fireplace and we kept that going 24 hours a day, meaning it had to be stoked a couple of times each night to ensure that our pipes did not freeze. We slept under lots of covers and nights were okay except for stoking the fire and keeping it going. We went to bed early, as even with a fireplace and candles it wasn't romantic enough to beat the fact that it was still cold. We were lucky. We live on Spectacle Pond, and the pond had melted just that week before with warm weather, and so it hadn't refrozen yet. So I could run down to the pond with 2 buckets, get water, and flush the toilets every morning. The biggest problem was the extreme damage it did on our property. So many trees and branches and limbs down. We spent the days cutting branches and pulling them out of the way. And that was hard when we came in, cold and wet, and the house was cold and dark. And the fact that the ice on the trees bowed them over so that we couldn't use our driveway or our road until we did some pruning and some clearing. Our neighbor, Leon Weaver, offered us wood, which was welcomed when it looked like we were going to deplete our supply. And he was able to trace the problem with our electricity. He saw just to which house it was still supplying electricity, at a Littleton neighbor who had his wires put underground. And where the wires came up from the ground, Leon found that they'd snapped. He was able to pinpoint our problem to Littleton Light and Electric people as soon as they came around. And by the next day, we were back to normal.
The next one I have was submitted by Carolyn Harlow. And she starts, I'm not the greatest writer, but here is what I experienced the night of the ice storm. At 11:45, our power went out for the second time that night. We didn't think much about it, and it was fun when it began. Oh, but what was that? A gunshot? Are we under siege? I wandered the house all night, expecting to have a tree fall on it. Sometimes it sounded like animals were running across the roof. It was huge amounts of ice pellets falling from the branches. The next morning we saw the mess. We have very old pine trees on our land, and they got a cleaning, and we got a branch through our car's windshield. The worst part was no power for 4 days. First, I cooked on the fireplace. Then the next night the temperature went down to the low 20s, so we went downstairs, and the next 3 days I cooked on the wood stove. This kept the temperature in the 60s. Our neighbor at the end of Cricket Lane brought us water to wash and cook with. The young people from across the street helped us to remove branches from the road. But it was difficult to move many because they were a foot or more in the ground. They'd hit the ground with such force, being so laden with ice pebbles. However, we were much luckier than others around, like the Jaffrey Keene area, who went 4 weeks without power. This really made you appreciate modern conveniences and the terrible hardships people went through before them. Praises to the men and women in the highway, fire, police, and electric light departments who were working night and day to get us power. We have never been through anything like this, and hope we never do again.
This was sent in by Ann Sweat. She entitles it Nightmare on Goldsmith Street. During the early hour of 4:35 a.m. on December 12, 2008, I was awakened by a loud smashing, crashing, horrible sound. I thought it was a nightmare, and in reality it was. There was no power as I crept through the house with my flashlight, shaking and trembling, so I felt like my heart would come through my chest. I really thought it was an airplane crashing through my house. As I looked out my back door, there was a tree on the deck, and I thought, wow, it must have been really windy out to have blown there during the terrible ice and rainstorm we had during the night. However, when I went to the kitchen window, so dark outside, but with the flashlight I could see these huge branches within a 1/4 inch of the glass just hovering there. My son ran outside in the icy rain and in disbelief saw that a huge oak tree from our neighbor's yard had crashed right through my roof, just missing my chimney by an inch. It covered most of the roof, and that was the tree that was on the deck. A friend happened to be going by, Paul McGovern, and stopped and told my son he would be back to help him when it got light. My son then went up to the attic, and icy rain was coming through the holes where the branches had come right through the roof, and he had to put buckets and pails to catch it, as it was coming through my bathroom and kitchen ceilings. After daylight came, he took pictures of this tree on the roof, and Paul cut a lot of the big branches off the house so we could have Lanny Poor, another great friend, and his big logging truck take the major part of the tree off the house. It was a horrible experience to go through, and so much damage, and so many openings in the roof. Later in the morning, my grandson Adam and friends of ours stopped by to help clear some of the wood up, and then they helped Chuck put huge tarps on the roof to cover it. I am so lucky, as I know it could have been much worse, and we are grateful and thankful for our family and friends who helped us at this disastrous time. One day, all the snow and ice from this terrible winter of snow and ice storms will be gone, and my roof will be repaired, but the memories of that horrible sound will not be forgotten. So that's my story and the nightmare on Goldsmith Street. Besides the huge potholes on the street, I now have some on my roof.
The next submission is from Barbara and Alan McRae. Barbara writes, "My daughter and grandchildren had just moved in a few weeks before the storm. Everyone was sound asleep when I heard a loud crash. Stephanie, our daughter, had heard it also, and both of us got up to see what had happened. We crept around the house, looking out of each window. Of course, no one else woke up. The sound had come from a tree limb falling against the house and pulling the electrical, telephone, and cable wires down. I was afraid of fire, so I decided to stay up and keep watch. We called the light department to make them aware of our problem. Stephanie and I curled up on the couch and waited for morning and to see the damage. We reminisced about the storm of '78, when her father had just returned from a tour in Saudi Arabia. And 100-degree weather, too. How many feet of snow? How tan he was under that knit hat while he shoveled. He had a nice cozy, we had a nice cozy spot and chatted for hours. This ice storm was going to keep our house without power for 5 days. During those 5 days, we used our fireplace for warmth, went to a neighbor's one night, and ate out a lot. We lost 3 trees and many limbs from other trees. Our neighbors had power in 1 day, but we had to wait so the cable, light, and electric companies could connect all our wires again. We were the second to the last house in town to be connected. All in all, we have not turned against Mother Nature or winter in New England. We still plan to stay until the end. Like with every season here, you know, it will be here today, gone tomorrow, or sometimes gone in 5 days."
This is sent in by Sue Cummings. The night of the ice storm, we were all asleep when we heard several crashes on our roof. We moved my son out of his bedroom because there was a tree hanging over that end of the house, and we were quickly losing branches. We were lucky that nothing came through the roof or took cable wires off the house, but it sure left a mess in the yard. My son had just bought himself a trampoline, and a large branch went right through it. Oh well, no one got hurt. The next day, while we were waiting for news about the electric power coming back on, the neighborhood kids played board games in front of a sunny window. If the power was on, they might have been playing Guitar Hero on their Xbox 260 instead. This was a welcome change. Upon learning that we wouldn't have power that night, we picked up our 92-year-old neighbor, Helen Flaherty, and drove to Lexington, 17 miles from here, to stay with my mom. She had power and empty bedrooms. We ended up staying there for 2 nights before our power was restored. We are so grateful to live in Littleton, where our electric company, our highway department, and our superintendent went above and beyond to keep us abreast of the happenings during the aftermath and quickly restored our power and our lives. Thank you very much. We sure take these conveniences for granted. Happy New Year.
And this entry is from an anonymous co-worker who submitted it through Marnie Oakes, who attaches, I don't know who wrote it, but it's hilarious, after the fact. Entitled, Our Nightmare Before Christmas. "'Twas 2 weeks before Christmas, and all through the town it rained and it froze, and the trees all fell down. The wires that were strung on utility poles snapped like a twig, and the houses all froze. We got ourselves nestled all snug in our bed, while visions of warmer days danced in our head. And me in my thermals and Pa in his cap stayed huddled together for a bone-chilling nap. The moon on the ice made a crystalline glow, and we thought to ourselves, just how long can this go? When what to our wondering eyes did appear but our son with some coffee and donuts and cheer. We could see our white breath in the darkness above, and deep under the covers I searched for my love. His feet, they were frozen, and so was his head. It made me think to myself that he just might be dead. The days passed so slowly, we must be insane, as we waited and wondered and called out by name, on Thursday, on Friday, on Saturday, oh, beep, on Sunday and Monday and Tuesday, please quit. On Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, oh dread, the kerosene fumes must have gone to our head. To add to the pleasure of winter's delight, 2 snowstorms came by, 18 inches of white. The snowing and blowing made things bad to worse, and we prayed to the heavens our pipes wouldn't burst. Pa's eyes now were sunken, his expression not merry. His cheeks had a pallor, his nose like a cherry. The odd little smile on his face wasn't fun, and sometimes he was mumbling, "Gonna go get my gun." Then a rap on the door, and the fireman said, "Are you sick? Are you sane? Is anyone dead? There's a shelter, there's warmth. You can come if you're able, and have showers and kindness and food on the table." And we looked at each other and thought, what the heck? Yeah, 11 days later you finally check. On night number 12, we heard the faint roar of a convoy of trucks, and we ran to the door, to the top of the poles, to the stretch of the cable. "Please bring us your power as fast as you're able." They spoke not a word and went straight to their work, and the power came on with a hum and a jerk. They heard us exclaim as they drove out of sight, "Merry Christmas to all! We have heat, we have light!"
Well, that's it. One for the ages. You know, many of us recall the blizzard of '78 and how that snowstorm has become the point of comparison, the standard really, that any blockbuster snowstorm is now measured by. And last year, the ice storm of 2008 raised the bar for ice storms. And for many of you, it was the unexpected experience of living without heat or electricity for an extended period of time. But it does warm us up to know that with Littleton Light, we have the A-Team getting us back online here in town. For Small Town, I'm Bob Spinozzi. Have a great day.
Oh, do you remember December '08 and the powerful ice storm that shut down our state? Oh, sometimes I wish we could go back to then. On second thought, let's never do that again. Sing tooralai, ooralai, ooralai. Sing tooralai, ooralai, ooralai.